Gen Z is unwilling to say that I am going to give my entire life to this. And then ultimately, they see their parents who are unhappy, who are getting a lot of health issues. I'm not going to sign up for this. And of course, they have an abundance of opportunities. So they're willing to explore that.
I'm of the opinion, if you're trying to give a reason, or if you feel the need to give a reason, you're basically choosing something that you believe the other person will feel to be valid.
Can empathy be manipulative?
What's the intention behind how you're using it? And what's the intention behind your impact from it?
Hey, I was just talking to someone about, we've talked about hard skills and soft skills before, right?
Yes.
And how soft skills is totally the wrong or inappropriate term to use. Do you know the history of how that came about?
I actually do.
Yeah, tell us.
I actually do. Well, I have mom brain, so I'm going to do my best to reflect this. If I'm incorrect, then correct me. But this came about, I believe, in the 60s or something around. They had contractors come into the military and ascertain what skills were imperative for soldiers to succeed, especially under duress, as they often are. And they assigned the term soft skill to mean nothing metal.
Yeah.
Like it's something not metallic, but also a skill, versus a hard skill, which is like machine guns, weaponry, bullets, things of that nature.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And what I was reading too was that there was actually an expression of, I wouldn't say regret. I don't know. I wasn't in the room, but maybe we should have actually renamed it something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think now that's definitely the thought. But those skills that they brought those people in were to help military leaders be better leaders, right? And one of the things that I've noticed when people who are very good at their jobs, that tends to indicate promotion to managing other people who are doing that job. But what we're never taught are those skills that leaders need to manage other people as opposed to doing the thing. And one of those skills is empathy. Right? Empathy is one of those skills, and we are so blessed and grateful to welcome Payal Beri to the show. Payal is a PhD, which is a lot of years schooling and studying, and she's researching all things about empathy and what we need to know about empathy. And I got to tell you, if you want to make the world go round, you can't do it by yourself. You got to do it with other people. And the currency or the way to do that is through empathy. Payal, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk to you guys. And wow, I just learned a new fun fact too. I had no idea that is what soft and hard skills meant. That's great to know now.
Always the student and always the teacher, correct?
Definitely. Yeah. I'm such a curious nerd. So I definitely am going to add that now to my little pocket.
I love that.
So what do you call those skills? Well, let's not call them soft skills any longer. What are they?
I call them core skills. I think of this as the foundation of every person. And what we think about, just when you're interacting, like the thing is that we're not interacting with objects and we're not building with, materials and things like that. We're building with people. And so, and I think that there is some beauty in recognizing that, if we even think about when, COVID happened and the world kind of stopped, what was it that carried people through? What was the resilience? What was it that helped people continue to be in this world? What did we notice that was happening with nature? What did we notice that was happening with our earth? Right? It was all because of this core element of being able to support each other, come together. We saw how much the world is reliant on each other, that even though we may think we live in these individualistic societies and on our day to day, we're just kind of moving and moving and moving. But we are so internally dependent on each other and our societies. So ultimately, it's the core of what makes us, exist.
I love it. So before we get into empathy and all things your work, take 30, 60, 90 seconds. Take the rest of the episode. I think you will need it. But tell us Payal's brag reel. Tell us the highlights. Tell us all the good things, all of your achievements, because I really want the listeners to know that this work is important and you're making drastic shifts in the way people approach their work. I mean, I think before the show, you were telling me you're speaking to 100 C-suite executives, and I think we need to know how valuable what we're going to talk about is here today. So tell us everything about you, Pyle.
All right. Well, so I guess so this is my memoir. No. um, so, I always start with sharing that what my commitment is and what my particular mission is. And really my mission is to help people, leaders, communities realize that we have a lot more in common as humans than otherwise led to believe by those who benefit from our divide.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's very easy to fall into that space. So, and the reason why this has become such a big commitment for me is it's not necessarily of the accolades or the research or any of that. It's really about my own personal life, which led me to what I'm researching is that I was a third culture kid. So, I'm Indian, yes, but I didn't grow up in India. I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Dubai, Iraq, Egypt. We moved to New York, Florida, Jersey, Australia, California. I moved everywhere. And I, like, before the age of 10, I lived in, I don't know, 15 or 18 different places, 3, 4 different continents, over 8 countries. So my experience of having moved around at such a young age, definitely the stability of that wasn't there. But what I would say is that I would not trade that for the world because it allowed me to experience culture, people in different countries in a way that when we finally came here, I don't have an American centric attitude about the world. And when I'm even talking to anyone who, whatever they are, I'm always looking at it as okay, fundamentally as humans, we share the same emotional responses and everything. It's just how do we manifest that into our values? And so when I hear and when I've experienced that, I've experienced bullying as a kid, I've experienced racism, I've experienced love, and I've experienced compassion, I've the full spectrum of it. And it always dawned, it kind of came to me of we're all going through stuff, but for some reason, when it's our community or it's my, whether it's my family, whether it's me, it's I feel it, right? It's palpable. But the minute it's about somebody else and they're going through something very similar, it's like this abstract thought. And we can't connect to the fact that they may be going through and experiencing the same things that we have. So all of that really led me to my work where I became a clinical therapist. I was working, doing home-based counseling in New York City. And that was also eye-opening. Imagine a girl who grew up in a very sheltered environment goes to doing home-based counseling in the projects of New York. First day I'm wearing a cute dress and heels and I'm oh, wrong outfit for this place. So next day back, in jeans and whatever. Even just putting myself in situations that were not part of my lived experience is what has just continued my commitment to, then moving into leadership development, becoming a speaker and starting my own company that's all about, how to empower a world with empathy.
So good. I think growing up, in 2 cultures for me, it is interesting because it's something that I felt was always lacking in the South Asian diaspora, but not quite in a way where I could say, there's no empathy here, right? There was not a word for it. I just felt off. And I love that, now we're coming into this, not only recognizing it, celebrating it, but really paying attention to it and how it really truly can change. It's not soft, it's not weak, but actually if we want to make more money, if we want to actually achieve goals that matter to us, if we want to live a life that feels like we're not just slogging away, empathy, is a core way to do that. And I just wanted to celebrate your recognition of putting all of that together in a way that is accessible, approachable. You've spoken to companies like Google. It's really impressive how all of these companies are really taking a look at this.
Especially as we're moving along with technology, as we're moving around with also you have to look at the play of generations, right? I do think that millennials played a really, really big role in core skills like empathy and emotional intelligence becoming important. I think about Richard Branson, who was a pioneer in moving away from this more traditional ways of what corporate America or just what corporate work looked like. I feel like it was always one way from like the Industrial Revolution up until like the 80s and 90s. And then the generations changed that. And I think it's like and then Gen Z now is like expecting a whole nother level of like what our work and life is supposed to look like. And I think it's because they're learning, they're seeing how that, what their parents and their grandparents, everyone experienced. Like if you look at the relationship between the way that we think about work, our relationship with that, and our relationship with our life structure, I think Gen Z is unwilling to say that I am going to give my entire life to this. And then ultimately, they see their parents who are unhappy, who are getting a lot of health issues. And, I think that, that's where they're just like, I'm not going to sign up for this. And of course, they have an abundance of opportunities. So they're willing to explore that. And so organizations, the reason that they're having to pivot and they're looking at this as like, okay, how do we engage? It's because they know that if they don't now shift the way that they work, they're going to lose out on really solid talent. And to your point about even like the South Asian piece of it, I think one of the things that's really important to mention is that there's also just been in our own culture and I know Seema, you and I have talked about this, that there's such a fixation on all of the paper checklist.
Yeah.
And the paper checklist, so people will say like, wow, look at that person. They graduated from Harvard or Wharton and they're this phenomenal doctor. What do you mean that they're not a nice person? And it just always boggles my mind that you're attaching a checklist of accomplishments to character of a person, and they really have nothing to do with each other. And so I think that even piece of focusing on the status in our community really comes from, if you think about immigration and take it even back further, you look at partition of India and Pakistan and what they went through with the British Empire, you have this generational experience of scarcity. I have to rebuild, I have to recreate. And then that gets passed down and passed down. And so then we have this idea that in order for me to continue to move up, I need to hold on to these elements that are the technical skills or the technical parts of accomplishment. But then you'll notice that the individuals who are like, okay, great, I got the great job, I've got the great degree, I've got my kids, I've got my house, I've got this, and then they hit a midlife crisis and they're wondering like, what am I doing with my life? Why am I so unhappy? Right? Because we never allowed that part to be nurtured.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up the partition, because this is twice now that we've had it come up. And I think I can only speak for myself here, but I never really thought about colonialism or the partition or any of that in a tangible way. You kind of tend to think to yourself like, well, that was my grandparents' generation and that was then, much like you were talking about how it becomes abstract, right? More and more, especially as time goes on. But I think it's important to highlight that, no, we're still living the effects of those things. Absolutely. Even today. I really want to get to know from you, Payal, is what are you finding as you have, you're doing this research, you're speaking to all of these people, you're speaking to changemakers. What are you really finding in terms of empathy and just in all areas of life?
So to really be able to touch into empathy and to be able to lean into it in a way that is genuine, we have to first address the wounds and the internal self. So there's two kind of elements of emotional regulation or emotional capacity. You've got your primal emotions, right? So you've got fear, you've got anger, you've got happy, joy, like these very basic primal emotions. And when I talk to people, or when, even in my research, it shows is that in order to truly access empathy in the way that it should be accessed, we have to first understand how to take more regulated approach to the primal emotions that are what I would say are reactionary response. So if you look at the world and the state of the world that we're in right now, and we look at the divisiveness just even in the US, we look at and let's even go like one step further, right? Like even in our South Asian culture, like it's not monolithic, right? We have multiple, like Seema, you're one culture, I'm another one, right? Like Dinesh, you're another one. And so it's like there's multiple, and it was like we were just grouped together by the British to be like, you're one country, but really we all have our
Mm,
different ways of existing and everything, right? And so anyway, so when we look at all of this, is that there's a lot of wounds that people are carrying. And so reactionary response happens because we haven't learned how to necessarily heal those wounds. When you're able to take more and recognize that, oh, wait a second, this thing that's happening right now is creating fear in me. And fear is a normal response because in human biology, right? Like fear is what keeps us alive. It's the survival technique. It's the I can be aware of the threat, The caveman days, the threat was a lion or a bear. Today the threat could be an internet bully. It could be your boss at work. It could be something else, but that fear is what keeps you moving. So what happens is that when we're not aware of those emotional responses, then we just go into reactionary move. So then what happens is that when we actually want to have empathy, and of course, like I work with a lot of social impact founders, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and purpose-driven people who like really feel compelled to making a difference in the world.
mhm,
But when we're working with them, I always ask the question is your work and is your impact being activated by fear or by empathy? Because in
mm,
order to actually move from a place of empathy, you've got to be aware of your own discomforts, right?
Mhm.
You've got to be aware of your own story. You've got to be aware of what triggers you, what kind of creates an emotional response within you.
mhm,
Because when we're trying to be there and learn someone else's perspective, if we start then dismissing it by saying, "Oh, well, I've never seen that happen. So I don't know." Or like, "Really? Is that true? I don't know. Let me look that up." Right?
yeah.
We've immediately dismissed their reality because
Mhm,
it's so uncomfortable for us to believe that a reality outside of our own can exist.
mhm,
So, in order to access that empathy, we have to have a good understanding of being able to say, wow, that is such a different life experience than I have had.
Mhm.
Can you share more? Help
yeah.
me understand more, right? It's the way we approach that. And there's also a misconception with empathy that, a lot of times people say, well, I don't understand because I've never lived that. Or like, for example, like I'm not a mom and, people who I have that are friends who aren't moms either be like, I can't have empathy because I'm not a mom. And I'm like,
Mm,
okay, interesting. First of all, you can never realistically ever experience someone else's life, even your own sibling, right? Like, how many times
Mhm.
have you talked to your sibling and you're like, you grew up with those parents? Like, I didn't. So it's just like you have a different experience. And part of that is recognizing that, okay, so where am I? What is my story? What do I understand of that? And then empathy is actually just understanding the context of someone else's life, right? So
yeah.
Mhm.
have you ever felt disappointed? Like when you're talking, right, about having mom brain or whatever like that is, right? And you're describing it and I can just all I'm paying attention to is your emotional response. Do I
Mhm,
hear defeat in you? Do I hear disappointment? Do I hear that I just feel exhausted? Do I feel like if someone puts one more thing on my plate, I am going to rip my hair out? Have
mhm,
I ever felt that way? Has
yeah.
I ever experienced that? It may not be in the same capacity, but have I ever felt sadness, disappointment, anger?
Yeah.
I'm connecting to you based off of understanding that what you're going through is hard. And I've been
Mhm,
through something
Mhm.
hard, and that's painful. I'm
mhm,
not making it about myself because empathy is not about you.
yeah.
Mhm.
Empathy is an interesting concept to me for the reason that I think proximity and distance really matters. And I think I saw some research that, you know, those television commercials for like for $1 a day you can feed a baby
Yep.
somewhere else in
Yeah.
the world. Um, People are more likely to give or contribute if it was, like their neighbor or something like that,
Mhm.
versus someone far away where it's almost like you have to take the time to put yourself into a position to understand that context, even
Right.
though what's being demonstrated is much more graphic or dire or whatever it is, right? Um, what is that about empathy, and how can we, not cut against it, but but counteract either from the person who is looking for empathy, right, is in need of empathy, or from a place of a leader, for example, right?
Yeah.
Or um, I'm just trying to understand, like, how can we balance this nuance of empathy?
Yeah. So, whenever people think about empathy, there's always that general meaning of it. There's actually three specific different types of empathy that exist. And then there's even like seven below that level of empathy. So the particular types of empathy that are a little bit more under the bigger umbrella is compassionate, emotional, and cognitive.
Mm.
So when we're talking about it from like a leader perspective or when you're trying to connect with others, right? Cognitive empathy is where you intellectually can understand someone's going through something, but you don't emotionally actually experience the same emotions.
Mm.
So you're able to, and those are really great when you're like trying to do negotiation tactics, right? And you're just like going into a room and you understand the buyer psychology. You understand like, okay, this person who's in the room is going to be experiencing it. This is what they're probably going to come with. So how do I want to connect with them? But you're very, very aware that it's not necessarily your body hasn't taken it on as if experiencing like it's your own
Mm,
emotional response, right? Then there's emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is where your brain actually starts mirroring the empathy that someone else is experiencing, right? So that's where then body language starts mirroring each other. But you still don't have that reactionary response of like knee jerk, I want to do something about it. Emotional empathy is like you're recognizing it. And those are really great for like mentorship type situations, coaching, where you're navigating somebody else through their experience. You're connecting on the emotion.
mhm,
What you just touched on is compassionate empathy. That's what like politicians use, commercials use. And it's this idea that you feel it so deeply internalized in you that you can't help but impulsively take a knee jerk reaction and do something about it.
mhm,
And that
Mm.
really is, those three different types of empathy that exist. And that if you tap into whichever one, knowing the situation you're going into, you're able to move into that space.
mhm,
So the example that you used of like, why is it that we, would feel more connected to giving to somebody right next to us versus someone far away? Part of that is trust, right? You
mm,
have a relationship. You have this you have a personal relationship. You feel it in the community. It's like this helping a neighbor is helping yourself as well. It's like being right there. When we think of something as like as so abstract as like, okay, I understand there's poverty going on in the country and that's sad and sure I can help. I think part of that also is just like the way that we're interacting with it. I think that getting more informed about what does that really mean, even for, if this kid in Africa or wherever it is that they always show is in struggling, how does that, tie it back to what is that, what would that feel like for me, and what does that $1, $2 even mean for me to be able to just contribute in this way
yeah.
for those people. And just, I think that, building that empathy piece is really coming from a place of like, again, looking at it as we are really one society.
Mhm.
Something I'll touch on there as well is that I think that there's a place for ownership
Mm,
and accountability. And what I mean by that is that we live in a world where when people say, well, that has nothing to do with me, right?
Mm.
Like that doesn't affect me.
Mm.
We live in a world where everything affects each other. And we saw that plain and blank through COVID.
Mhm.
And so if we don't actually see that, yes, actually, even your indifference is a reaction.
mhm,
Mm.
And so your indifference, whether it's politically, whether it's socioeconomically, whatever it is, that actually is making a difference. I'll give a maybe a controversial example, but
yeah.
there's a lot of obviously frustration with like homelessness, right? In a lot of
Mhm,
cities. We'll take San Francisco as an example. A lot of reaction is, oh my God, there's so many homeless people. There's so much going on here, right? Of oh gosh, they're just everywhere. Okay. How about taking some ownership over the fact that San Francisco, over progressively in the last 30 years, has become Silicon Valley technologists? You have finance people who moved over from New York. And as much as they are about quote unquote saving the world, they're there to make a buck.
mhm,
They're there to make a lot of money, right? Technology, startups, all that world. So you're moving in, you're gentrifying places, you're making places so expensive that people who were able to live there at one point can't afford to live there anymore. Now they're on the streets. So it's not necessarily only people who are, intoxicated or doing drugs or whatever. It's also people who may have lost everything because they had too many healthcare bills and now they just can't afford it. They lost their job. They were never able to recover, whatever it is, right? Taking ownership over the fact that I play a role in the fact that I moved here paying those expensive prices. And that also caused this increase in homelessness. The second complaint is always, well, they'd rather be on the streets than in the shelters. They'd rather be, all this. Okay. Again, instead of blaming the individual let's look at that, why is it that they'd rather be on the street than in the shelters? What's going on in the shelters? What's going on in our systems that's preventing them from wanting to go to a place that's safe for them? Shelters have a really high rate of rape.
Yeah.
Shelters have a really high rate of violence. Shelters also, a lot of them will only keep you for 3 days max, 1 week, 3 weeks, a month. If you and I lose our jobs, if we, have health issues, whatever happening, it takes us 3 to 6 months to get up back on our feet, and we have a good foundation. How can we expect someone who has nothing, who's lost everything, with everything stacked against them, to get everything sorted in a month? And so when they are less safe in what we are providing for them than they are on the streets, then the question needs to flip. Not again at the individual, which is what systems do, is that they get you to blame the individual versus like taking a bigger, deeper look. But we need to actually be asking, how do each one of us play a role in what we're doing for our greater society?
I love the curiosity that comes almost hand in hand with empathy. You can't really do it without.
Yeah.
Can empathy be manipulative?
Say more.
You, as someone who is empathetic, you touched on, politicians, negotiations. Can it be used manipulatively if you're truly empathetic? Because it seems like they are, contradictory values, if not, not really, I wouldn't call manipulation a value.
I think that, to your point, it's the intention behind it, right? So for anything, it's like, if my intention behind the curiosity of how do we solve for homelessness? How do we solve for mental health? How do we solve for, school systems that are, in certain areas not doing as well as other areas? Like, how do we solve for those? Again, with the intention of it being for the greater good of the society versus what's in it for me, right? So if we're operating from that selfish place, right, of that place of, I got to just take care of me, we'll figure it out. Again, where is that coming from? It's rooted in scarcity. It's rooted in, I don't have enough, right? It's rooted in those things where it's like, I need to protect for me and then we'll figure it out afterwards. Politicians, commercials, advertisement, absolutely. What are they doing? Because, and this is what I always find interesting, is that, people will say, well, I don't, you've got to make practical decisions. Okay. But even your practical decision has been incentivized by emotion. Any decision you make, ultimately, what gets your attention is because they're tapping to advertisers, absolutely are manipulating your emotions.
Yeah.
They know how to play into it, right? Empathy is something that's taught with buyer psychology. It's taught to salespeople. It's taught to negotiation tactics, right? Like anything that is service oriented, anything that is to grab the consumer, you're absolutely going to use empathy, right? But again, so that's where it goes back to, what's the intention behind how you're using it, and what's the intention behind your impact from it?
We're all, manipulation, the term in and of itself, I feel like, at least for me, creates a reactionary, but we all, as humans, trying to communicate and create, whether it's positive change, selfish change, or selfless change, what I'm hearing you say is that it's not the manipulation. It's not the guidance forward. or to the side, or, but is it rooted in, I'm doing this, yes, I'm manipulating, but for you, right? I'm creating value in you, 75-year-old dad, needing to go out and take a walk, or I'm empathizing and manipulating or creating value in um, kid, broccoli's yummy, or hey, colleague, it's great to be able to pick up the slack and, take this one so that I can be rested and take the next one for you,
Yeah, that's where like I don't necessarily want to use the word manipulation with that, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
I don't think that's the right and appropriate way. I think of when I'm thinking manipulation, it is the ick. It is the like, but
Yeah.
what I think that I was trying to what I was hearing before and what I was talking about is more of that empathy is just an intention. It's a way of understanding each other, right? It's a way to pause and not have a reaction. We're not trying to manipulate people into doing something that is negative or evil or
Right.
bad.
Mhm.
It's more about really looking at how do we understand each other? How do we raise awareness? How do we recognize? How do we come to a middle ground? How do we approach each other, not from a battleground? I always say, whenever people say like, oh, well, I'm not confrontational. I don't like to
Mhm.
have like, it's okay. Well, you're telling me two things. One is I always make a joke. I'm like, no one's telling you to get into a boxing ring and fight this out. Like, that's not what we're doing,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Second is that you're kind of gaslighting people who have healthy communication skills because communication and empathy go hand in hand. It's
Mhm.
that in order for me to understand someone else's perspective, not make assumptions, right? There's a
Mhm.
really big, especially in our South Asian culture, there's so much assumption building because, oh, I just don't want to impose. I don't want to ask. I don't want to. Why not? What
Mhm.
uncomfort is it bringing up in you, right? What tension is it bringing up for you to just put it out there? And then what happens, right? Then the other person thinks, oh, well, they didn't even ask me. So I guess they don't want me there. Or like, oh, they didn't even ask me for this. So maybe I'm not good enough for that, right? You're
Yeah.
creating and building up this like disengagement. And then you wonder later, like, what happened? But then nobody's willing to approach that.
Yeah.
So if you actually look at it from a place of curiosity, like we were talking about earlier, and we look at it from a place of good intention that, hey, I care about this person. I genuinely want to see the best for that person. So I'm just going to have a conversation with them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Again, words hold a lot of power. So
Mhm.
if we can look at the words and how we define them and what meaning is attached to that. So instead of saying like, oh my gosh, I need to talk to Dinesh, but I just don't want to be confrontational. Instead of it being like, hey, you know what? I need to have a conversation with Dinesh. I really care about him and I really see his perspective, but I want to understand it more so that, because it's bringing up a little bit of uncomfort in me. So instead of assuming that, oh, Dinesh must be this and this and this, I'm going to be like, hey, Dinesh, I'd love to have a conversation with you. You talked about this point, and I want to understand a little bit more about your context. Can you share more?
We're talking about Payal agreeing to buy me a Ferrari, and she is clearly wanting to understand my perspective and why I
Absolutely.
need a Ferrari.
And you know what? I think that as long as they take some Monopoly money, we're good to go.
She'll get you like one of those model cars.
Yeah, the one that comes in the cereal boxes.
I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah. If you put the word manipulation there, then yeah, you're going to think of it as like, oh, see, this is why I don't want to engage in
Yeah.
that. But if you look at it
Mhm.
more as a place of like, no, I genuinely care. And, and when you are feeling like uncomfortable or you're feeling like, oh my gosh, something's being activated in me, ask yourself, what's influencing this? Instead
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
reacting to it, find out like, wait a second, am I being influenced by this commercial? Am I being influenced by my society, my community? Is that what's causing me to think that I need to go do XYZ versus actually see like how much judgment exists in our culture? Holy crap. Right.
Yeah.
And so how do we eliminate that judgment? And I think that
Mhm.
it's okay where people need to hold space for and. So I'll
Mhm.
give an example. Um 2 years ago, I was living in New York and I was there for 6 months and I got on a subway and sat down, whatever. And there was a homeless guy who was standing right across from me. And I don't know what it was about me. I was just like sitting there. Maybe it was a girl, maybe because I was wearing a specific color. I don't know what it was, but you could tell he was getting angry, and his hand started becoming like a fist. And it was just like he was ready to punch me in the face, right? The guy who was sitting across from me noticed this too. And he's like, hey, let's flip seats. We flipped seats. Immediately, the guy calmed down. My thought in my mind was absolutely, yes, I am going to be worried about my safety and my security of like, I don't want this guy punching me in the face. But at the same time, I was also not looking at him as some crazy monster that I need to be like, oh my God, ew. I was looking at it as, okay, I need to first protect my safety. And then second thing was like, I really hope that we can get him the care that he needs.
Mhm.
Right?
I love that you talk about the and, because that's such, Dinesh and I've talked about this a lot on the show in various ways. Especially when you are put in this am I physically safe? It's very easy to fall to safe, yes or no, right? Good or bad. And when you can hold space for, okay, I can address safety, that's not selfish. And also, you may never know what triggered in this guy. I mean, maybe you looked like an ex-wife or something. I don't know. But you just, it's really, really important to highlight that you can hold space. And importantly, you didn't need to leave the car. You didn't need to get off the subway. You didn't need to blow your little whistle or pepper spray. It was simply just shifting a few inches over.
Yeah. And then, we just made sure that we had by the next stop that we like just had some security or whatever who could come on and do what they needed to do. Like, that's it. You can still treat people like human beings, right? And I always say, like, when I was a clinical therapist, I used to work in outpatient doing severe psychosis work, schizophrenia, bipolar, all of that kind of work. And even in that space, I remember there was a guy, he was in his 50s and he actually belongs to a very well prominent family. And he himself had graduated from Wharton, was at the top of his career in finance and was making millions. And then schizophrenia hits you in your 30s, typically. And so, it starts to kind of really, really show up at that point for men. And so that's when it hit him. And now he, lives in this, like in a home, and he does this outpatient work, and he has very vague memory of his past. And this was an internship that I was doing for my graduate school program, and my graduate school was ending. So I was finishing up this program. And so the psychologist there was saying like, okay, this is Payal's last day. She's finishing her program, blah, blah, blah. This guy says to me, he's like, oh, where did you go? Did you go to Yale? Did you go to Harvard? Did you go to Stanford? And I'm like, no. And I was like, UC Riverside. And he's like, oh, like even in his illness, he's judging me, right? Like for not going to an Ivy League school. But me bringing that up also is the fact that he didn't choose to be a schizophrenic. He didn't choose to be bipolar, right? Some of these individuals who have become homeless, they didn't choose to become homeless. And so I think that there's this idea of recognizing that people who are going through hardships, no one wakes up and says, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to have a really tough day and I'm going to end up in a bad situation. Like no one does that intentionally.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah. I also think for me, what I've recently learned is that tough is subjective, hard is subjective, and bad is subjective, right? And a lot of times, and Seema, we've talked about this before, a lot of times you'll see people attempt to give a reason for why they can't do something or unable to do it. And, we talked about this with Nilu, and I'm of the opinion that if you're trying to give a reason, or if you feel the need to give a reason, you're basically choosing something that you believe the other person will feel to be valid, right? So let's just use this podcast, for example. If I said, hey, Payal, Seema, I'm sorry, I can't record this. There's a storm and the power went out, right? Probably reasonable. But if I said, hey, Payal, Seema, I can't record this because I want to go to the gym, you'd be like, you're judging my reason, right? So that's why I think that using that example, we have to be careful what lens we impute on other people as to, is it a hard time? It's not for me, or it is for me. Is it a bad time? It's not for me, or it is for me, versus you. And really take cues from what's hard for that person. It's really hard for my kid to do algebra right now, right?
Oh, I hated algebra.
It's also hard for me too, right? But I don't think we need to experience the same hard to understand what hard is. So,
Right.
right, for you, I mean, you're just starting a new podcast. The first episode might be hard, right? But for me, cutting down the tree might be hard, but we can
Mhm.
reach common ground on knowing what hard feels like for me and what hard feels like for you. You
Yeah,
agree with that?
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's all relative. And I think that there's also that, when we justify things, well, I should just be grateful that I even have this job, or I should be grateful that, you know, um, we've got food on our table. Like, what are you complaining about? Right. It's
Mm.
minimizing that um you it's not okay to aspire for more.
Hmm.
And there's also to that point, like, we were talking before we started recording, is like, you both are parents, I'm not. And then there's always this like tension between like non-parents and parents, of like parents thinking like, oh, you probably have it so much easier, your time is your time, you can do whatever you want. And
Yeah.
it's like this minimizing of, you know, things that are in my life that are valuable. And
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah, fine, I don't have to necessarily take care of another human being, but my time is also not just easily flexible or
Right.
adjustable or whatever I have,
Yeah.
right? I have commitments of some sorts.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's being able to recognize that. And this is why I mentioned, so my framework that I've built in my research and what I teach essentially, and, whether it's at my retreats, whether it's at when I'm working and speaking at clients, it's called Reframing Perspectives, and it's
Hmm.
compassion for self, empathy for others, and accountability for both. So that's where what you're talking about is the way that we can have that empathy, we can understand that we may have different perspectives or we may have different hearts, is that we have to first become comfortable with recognizing and being okay with our own hard, with our own toughness, and with our own ease, and
Yeah.
not look at that as anything you have to be guilty or ashamed of. It's just you're recognizing that it exists. And that's
Yeah.
that's when you can be able to sit there and be present with somebody else.
I
So
love
good.
that.
Pyle, you are amazing. I mean, this has been such a great conversation. What is something that you can share with us, whether from your work or just from your life, that our listeners can implement today and beyond a doubt uh, have an impact on their life today?
There's no reality in the sense of like your brain, it doesn't know the difference between reality and figment of imagination, right?
Yeah.
And so whatever world that you want to perceive yourself in, it's like you actually are just like kind of feeding yourself that. I think
Mhm.
something that someone could just take as an easy action right now is really looking at that when you are coming across situations, circumstances, even with just, it doesn't have to be as something as big as these social impact things we're talking about. It could just be even in your home, right? Your neighbor, your friendships, whatever it is, that the minute that they start talking about what they're experiencing, they're going through, just start noticing what's happening internally to you, and give yourself a 10-second pause before you want to say something. Just give yourself
Mm.
a 10-second pause. And in that 10 seconds, just give yourself that moment of being able to ask them, instead of asking questions from a place of like, why did you do that? Or why did that happen? Or you did this. Try asking questions from a, hey, how did that happen?
Mhm.
What went on? Walk me through this. When we avoid whys and yous, you avoid the defensiveness. When we
Mhm.
actually ask questions more from that, like, tell me more, what happened? Walk me through this. You're inviting somebody in to share more with you, and they actually open up more. So
Mhm.
try that technique and see what happens in building those relationships.
I felt like my own nervous system, I was already pretty calm, but shifted even more into a state of ease. So such a valuable
Mhm.
tip that we can easily implement. I'll thank you so much. So we play a game called Ask It Forward. Listeners, if this is your first time tuning in, essentially what we're going to do, Payal, someone has left a question for you. We're going to ask that of you, and they didn't know who you were, what you were going to talk about, when we were going to record. They knew nothing. So we're going to ask that question of you. You get to answer it on the spot, and then, haha, you get to leave a question in a similar manner for the next guest. Your question is from Anusha Hussain. She is the author and podcast host of The Pain Gap,
Ooh.
which talks about the intersection of racism and sexism and how it's killing women in America and American medicine. She asked you, why did you decide to be a guest on the Happy and Human podcast? And what was your intention or your motive behind doing it?
Because it's talking to you and Dinesh, so why not? I
No, no.
think
Her question is, what is your ulterior motive?
no, really, I think that it's Honestly, it's just really refreshing and uplifting to be able to have conversations with other South Asians on these deeper topics. I think that doesn't happen enough. And it's just really nice to be able to talk to people who care about these issues and who are continuing to spread, build more awareness within South Asia. So we're shifting our value system from these superficial ones to deeper ones.
What is your question for the
Oh,
next
gosh.
guest?
I mean, I guess I'm going to ask the question that makes most sense to me is that what is your intention behind the work that you're doing? Is it being led with fear or is it being led by empathy?
Yeah, listeners, I encourage you to also, we'll ask this of the next guest, but like we've always said, take a moment and use these questions to reflect. And I think you will find that a lot of clarity can come from answering these questions yourselves. I know I will.
Yeah. And I think that, I'll say this really quickly is that people may think that, well, no, of course I'm leading with empathy because I care so much. And it's like, but what is the words? What is like, are you experiencing scarcity? Because when we act from a place of fear, we're doing a lot of work from urgency and we're doing a lot of work from this like tension and place of like, this has to change, this has to, and then we're sharing a lot of things that are of like negativity or grievances. And what happens with that is that even though you're motivating your community, you're motivating them from a place of like scarcity and fear. And just then that turns into like, we need to only think about our community. Like, think about again what's happening in the world right now.
Yeah.
When we lead with a power of empathy, we're actually showing them like what's possible, what you can do, what's opportunity. Look at the power of coming together, of humanity, the unity. And when you do that, how that actually ends up like having your community thrive.
Pyle, you are, like I said, just a wealth of information, and we're so grateful that you're here. One of the ways that we try to thank our guests for coming on here is by giving them an opportunity to share an organization that's close to them. And Seema and I will make a contribution on behalf of you to that organization as a way of, saying thanks and for raising awareness for some different organizations that our guests might be involved in. So we'd love the opportunity for you to share an organization that we can make a contribution to.
Thank
What's
you. So the acronym it's LCLC, which stands for Lawndale Christian Legal Center. It's based in Chicago, and essentially what they do is individuals who are formerly incarcerated, and once they get out, they actually help them with getting all of their legal stuff together, their ID, their birth certificate, getting their home set up, getting them into careers as well, getting them jobs. It's been proven with research. If someone who was formerly incarcerated gets a job, they are 52% less likely to commit another crime. And so they are really an incredible organization that I'm connected to. I do a lot of work with them. My own work in RK Impact is going to be highlighting prison reform and talking about leading people through an experience of understanding how people are set up to enter the system. So LCLC in Chicago does phenomenal work around that.
That is so cool. I, love when guests come on and share about their organizations because we would really truly never know about a lot of these. And what's coming up for you that you want our listeners to know about? And tell us too, how can our listeners get in touch with you and where can they find you to just, kind of stay connected, maybe through social media or otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm probably the most active. Instagram's there too. You can go to my website as well, payalberi.com. There's really three ways that I contribute to this world. One is speaking. So speaking on empathy at organizations, at conferences, offsites, things like that. Second is that, I host retreats and I'm hosting one in December. And I'm really excited. This is specifically for, if you resonate with being a purpose-driven founder, a change maker, social impact, entrepreneur, any of those spaces, even if you work internally, but you are just very purpose-driven, this retreat is being held as it's an all-inclusive, adult-only space. Everything is covered. And essentially what we do is we really help you reclaim your own story so that you have more internal intention with being able to propel your impact further. It's done so because a lot of purpose-driven people tend to focus so much on giving that they forget to take care of themselves. So this is really doing some of that, internal healing and internal identity work so that they can then propel their impact further. And then the third thing that I am doing, which is my baby, this is the big thing, is launching RK Impact, which is a social impact arm of my business. And this is a pop-up immersive experience to take people through experiences of challenges that happen in our world. And you actually go through this entire experience. Think of it like escape room meets cultural IKEA. And the only way through it is to go through the whole thing. And through that, we then hold process conversations about, now that you have experienced what it's like to be homeless, what it's like to be, in the prison system, what it's like to be have a mental health issue. Now, how would you have that conversation? Now, how would you shift your perspective? I just believe that there's a lot of people who have opinions about things without ever having lived those experiences. So this is going to be launching in Chicago next year, in 2025, the pilot version. But you can totally get involved by going to rkempathy.com and just subscribing to knowing what we're doing and around that's work.
I love that. I went to one immersive experience when it was talking about what children in Africa, like their experience of, there was like a schoolhouse and it was like hay on the floor and they had one toothbrush that they shared. All these little things that you and I would never necessarily think about when we think about kids in Africa, not having access to education, right? It was really, really incredible. And what was missing from that, as impactful as it was that element that you just talked about, that reflective, okay, so now
what?
Where are we? How does that change? And what do you want to be different for yourself and for the world? And so we cannot wait to hear about this. We can't wait to celebrate it and amplify it. Payal, thank you so, so much. There's a ton of other questions we would have loved to ask you. We'll just have to have you back.
Yeah. And you'll just have to come on to my podcast and we'll just continue the conversation there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell us real quick about your podcast when it's launching.
Yeah, it's called Reframing Perspective. So it's all about reframing our perspectives and what we have, what we believe in. And it is going to be launching in October.
Terrific.
So I'll be having some phenomenal guests, some philanthropists on there. I'll have social impact people on there, athletes, like when we're just going to have conversation about some beliefs that they held really strongly, what shifted in them, and now how they have connected to a community. I'm actually having a guest on there who himself spent 25 years in prison for murder, but then the father of the son that he murdered was actually his biggest advocate and championed him through his prison experience and made sure he got an education, advocated for him to come out for a second chance. And they now stand together and advocate for prison culture, as well as helping people go through grief for experiencing loss in their family through gang violence.
Gosh.
Looking forward to your podcast.
We cannot wait.